Welcome back to episode 2 on the Rhythm of Daily Devotion. As promised, no changes here whatsoever.
No. And if you're listening, you have no idea what we're talking about, and
That's right.
It's okay.
Yeah.
You know, we did mention the last episode, though, and I think we need to be, honoring our long-term listeners.
Sure.
Is that this is one of the very few episodes where no one who's on this video or podcast is wearing plaid.
This is grievous oversight.
Yeah, we have definitely, because we always thought plaid brought out the best in the warehouse look that we're shooting in. So, exactly.
Yes.
So,
And I did think this early on. We are all wearing dark colors, so we blend in.
That's right.
Yeah, we're well camouflaged.
We got the floating head thing going on. So anyway.
So if you somehow found this first, you're definitely going to want to hit pause here in about 30 seconds and change episodes. So this is part 2 in a 2-part series on this Rhythm of Daily Devotion. We're starting the fall with this. And we just spent about 45 minutes in part 1 going over the first 2 of the 3 messages in this series. And so I'm sitting here with Lee Towns, Brian Bales, I'm John Ackerman. We didn't even do the introductions in episode 1.
That's right.
But if you've got this far, stop. Stop now. Go back and do part 1. The accompanying messages will still be here next day, next week, whenever you come back to us. But we now want to finish up with the third of the 3 messages in this series, continuing to keep the focus on the practical. How do we begin to do this? And we mentioned last episode, part of our daily devotion time needs to be allowing God to make the time about us rather than about Him.
Right.
And that part of those conversations is sometimes not going to be about getting answers, but understanding more about who God is and who we are. And that brings us to this third point, which is really that when we think about daily devotion, so much of the time we want to make it about what we do. Right? That there's a Bible to read and there's worship music to play and sing to, regardless of how your voice sounds, by the way. God doesn't care.
Joyful noise. That's the requirement.
Yeah. And there's specific, right? It's easy to get focused on the what to do, so much so that we create routine out of rhythm, as you mentioned, Lee, and it kind of kills the relationship. And so this third message is really sort of bringing us back to not only the heart of worship, but the heart of daily devotion, which is being in God's presence.
Yeah, and so, John, you did this teaching, which is really weird. Because typically, you're facilitating someone else who's done the teaching in that way. So I'm just going to hop in and do this.
I can't believe I had to write my own notes for this.
There you go. I'm going to, one of the parts that you brought up, right, is a tendency that we have as human beings, right? And that is comparison, right? And it just doesn't stop in the keeping up with the Joneses type of, hey, they just did this for their family, or they went here, or they have this, or whatever, right? We have those moments. But we even have a little bit of that comparative approach to our spiritual life, especially when it comes around daily devotions. And I'm going to say personally, I think a lot of that can accidentally happen because, you go out there, you look into the internet world and that sort of stuff. Really helpful things like daily devotional plans.
Right.
They give you readings. They give you all of those are all meant to be tools. Those are all super great.
Yeah.
Right.
But man, sometimes, we can begin to go, well, I'm not like this, or I'm like this, or like that sort of stuff. And so kind of unpack some of that.
And it's a good illustration you mentioned, just a few minutes ago in the previous episode about the morning time. It's easy for us, you look at other people and go, oh, they're up before light and they're having their time, pre-dawn. And if I'm up before light, pre-dawn, God's not getting anything out of me and not doing anything to me because I'm just a lump of clay, know? And so it's easy to compare and say, oh, the godly people, because Benjamin Franklin said, early to bed, early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. And we then translate that as to some kind of spiritual thing. Oh, you got to get up early. And for some people, that is the sweet spot. Yeah. That's where they are. But for other people, that's not the sweet spot. And it's difficult when you put yourself in that box.
John, you said this, the comparison of experiences often can prevent us from experiencing. And I know what I think about that. And the analogy I said, what were you fleshing out of that?
Yes. So I think it's, again, we're naturally prone in our brokenness to comparison, right? And for a lot of people, they walk around daily with the feeling of other people are probably doing better than me. Pick your category, right? They're doing better professionally, they're doing better relationally, they're doing better. And you see this all the time spiritually, right? And this is one of the dangers of having a podcast with 2.5 pastors on it. right, is
By the way, that would be a great name for another podcast.
Right, you put these faces in front of a camera, and to the best of our ability to be open and transparent and vulnerable, it still sort of creates this false sense of, well, if they struggle here, then I must be struggling here. And if this is what their connection with God looks like, then mine must be here. And so often, you go through the school experience, which is both my background, but also such a common experience that most people can relate to, and everybody's held to the same standard, right? Here's what everyone is supposed to be able to acquire or achieve, and you're rated on how close you get to that metric, right? And because that is so much of our early formative experience, it's so easy for us to misapply that to places where that was never the intention at all. And so we do that spiritually, right? We look at that hall of fame of faith in Hebrews 11 and go, well, I'm not living like that guy, that woman, that guy, that woman, that guy. And so one of the things that it took me a long time to stop doing that to myself. And I still do it at times because I want to learn from the people that came before, right? I love having these conversations with the two of you because you have just a couple more miles on the tires than I do, but you've also spent more of your life. Oh, I so badly want to put up numbers on the screen.
So many things I want to say, and I gotta leave it alone.
But you've been
He's not wrong.
You've been in this space, right? You've been in the church space for many more years than I have. You've been in this life with God for many, and so I love sitting with people that have been in these spaces longer because there is so much good to gain from it. But if we're not careful, it turns into tunnel vision of I need to model myself after, or I need to model myself after, or whatever I'm doing must be wrong. And instead, recognizing that the more we get to learn from the people that have come before, both living and dead, the more that we get to see how people, especially in this case, how they connect to God, how they experience the presence of God in their life. It doesn't have to be a limiting thing. It actually gets to be an expanding thing.
Right. So the psalmist says, right, we are fearfully and wonderfully made, right? And the uniqueness of who we are, it's this sort of reminder. You were talking, and I started backing up in my own life. If you would have heard maybe, the first couple years of me teaching up front, you would have gone, that is a bad version of Newt Larson. And Newt Larson is one of the most fundamentally impactful, next to Jesus Christ, human beings on my life as a pastor. If I'm ever 1/10 the pastor that man was to me, I will be 10 times better than I am now. He pastored this, it's not about the size of a church. I'm just saying it was 7,500 people, and I would watch him know people's names when they come in. I'd watch him get there at 6 a.m. on Sunday morning and take the farthest parking spot out. I watch him stop in a parking lot, pick up trash in the park. Just these things that he's modeling as a servant leader. Just amazing. And he was a great communicator. And I was a bad version of him because he was a great example, right? And then what happened? I have a next boss who I happen to have two unbelievably amazing bosses. And then you know what I turned into for another 3 or 4 years? A really bad version of Michael Easley, who was one of my, and it was interesting that you were saying that even in sometimes our well-intentions, what results is that we miss the aspect that we've been fearfully and wonderfully made. And that we can draw from this, and we can draw from this, or we can draw from this. However, God knows how he made us. And spending time with that to understand how that works well. And again, teaching isn't quite the same thing as what we're saying, but that was immediately what Pastor Armand, I'm like, that's exactly what I did. And I didn't even realize it until now you go back, and I even look at some of my sermon outlines, and I even made my sermon outlines like that person, right? Because they were so impactful in such a good way.
I think the same thing. I grew up with a very strong preaching dad. And so all my life I watched how my dad preached. And early in my career, I tried to emulate Farrell Towns. I have his name. I'm a junior. So I tried to become the second version. And somewhere in my, journey of growth, I went, wait, God made me Lee, and I need to be Lee. And yes, there are pieces of Farrell that are in me, and pieces of Roy, who was another highly influential pastor that shaped me as I was coming through the developmental process. There are pieces that are there, but God made me. And I was on staff with a guy once that, as we were talking about spiritual formation, he came with an idea and he said, listen, if we can get this template in place, then our job will be easy. We just put everybody in the template. And I had a visceral reaction to it. I was like, God's not a God of templates. Yeah. He's a creative God. And so he says, you are fearfully, I knew you, I knit you together in your mother's womb. All of your days were ordained before a single one of them occurred. All of those things, God's saying individually, I know you, I made you, and I made you intentionally just the way you are, not templates.
So, John, would this be a fair question for practically people to be like, okay, when I see the way that you engage it, right? And I'm going to say that one of the emotions that the enemy can try to invite into our lives, that we have to receive it, right, is shame. Yeah. Right? Like, in the last podcast, John said, hey, I've been spending the last X amount of days in Luke chapter 1. Yeah. Right? And I'm like, first off, I'm like, remind me, God, what was in Luke chapter 1? Right? I mean, that was eventually,
no idea.
I'm just like,
Christmas.
I
know it's Christmas.
Right? Yeah. Before Luke chapter 2, there's some lineage stuff, and he's telling him why he's writing it. I mean, I remember that, right? Exactly. But it can be really easy, right, for us to see other people, and have these moments experiencing God well. And instead of inviting God, what do I need to learn from this? Right? Is there anything I need to take for this? To take shame upon. Yeah. To where the enemy then goes, oh, you're not doing it like John.
Yeah.
Right? And John is theoretically the half pastor of the 2.5 pastors, because I know that's what he was saying, right? And if I'm supposedly a full pastor, but we've all done that, right? And so I think practically is even as you're hearing us, don't go, oh my word, they've got it together, I need to do it this way. A, we don't, and B, invite God in the process. What about what they're talking about in there? Should God, I take and allow you to apply to my own life because I'm fearfully and wonderfully made?
We talked in the last episode that one of our broken pieces in us as humans is we try to avoid pain and control pleasure. One of the things I've noticed that we try to do just in general with understanding, with behavior, is we try to understand so we can predict, so we can control. Mm-hmm. And if you look at the way that like my wristwatch is made, right? It's there's a lot of moving pieces, most of which I don't understand. But there's a way that it works, right? The template, right? And if you recreate it exactly, it always works. It will always function in the way that it's intended to. But God's not like that. Nope. Right? And we talked about it in the last episode, right? You can't read X number of words of scriptures in order to get God to do something or give something, right? Because God's complex, right? It's like the weather. And Virginia summer drives me crazy with the forecast, right? Because now I live on 5 acres, we have big garden, we have animals, and I need to know more often than not, is it going to rain? And the standing forecast for Virginia summer is 50% chance of thunderstorms. Mm-hmm. And it drives, right? Because the weather is not complicated like a wristwatch. It's complex, right? On this day, you put all these component pieces together, and this is the outcome, and it rains. And the next day, you put all the component pieces together that look almost exactly the same, and it doesn't rain, right? And you get a hurricane, and you don't get a hurricane, and you get a drought for a month, right? It's just, But what you do see, and I finally got a chance, I'm meeting with a guy lately who's a meteorologist, and he's been doing it a long time, and I got to run this by him, and he's like, yeah, that I just get to understand more and more what could happen. Not a guarantee of what will, but the more time I spend, I have a better idea, but I also know there's a chance I'm wrong. Right. Yeah. And that's what we get to do with this with God, right? You look in the scriptures, the number of times that it says, and the Lord appeared to. Mm-hmm. And then you look at what the Lord does when he appears to, and it's not the same. Right. And it doesn't even always have the same effect, right. But it begins to create in me a broader understanding of what could happen when I'm in the presence of God. What could he want to do? What might he want to say? So that when he does something, I have a better sense of, okay, that sounds like, feels like, that looks like God.
Right. So you're talking about this, and this happens often, I'm like, oh, once we start talking, like, oh, there's something I'm thinking about that I wasn't thinking about before. So I'm just going to kind of throw this out to you. It's a thought. I wouldn't say it if I didn't think it was true, right? You just talking about the diversity of experience, right? When the Lord appears to, and we compare experiences, and it prevents us from experience. And I think the first thing that we naturally do is like we look at someone else's, and it's really easy to think shame. What about the possibility that because someone else isn't approaching their daily devotion or that sort of stuff in the way that you are, that you develop pride?
Totally.
You begin to say, well, I don't believe they're there. I don't see them
Right.
doing this like
Right.
I do it. They don't get up at 6 a.m.
Right.
Or they're not praying like this, or they're not doing like this. And the reverse begins to happen,
Yeah.
and we become a sense of pride. How does that feel?
Absolutely.
I agree with that completely.
Yeah.
I can see that happen even in that tendency as we lead ministries, that we have this tendency to say, okay, you need to get to where I am, you know, and then we stiff arm people into that template
Sure.
that we've predetermined, not God's template. You got to get here, and we get so focused on the behavior modification piece of, you know, that I'm trying to make you like me, rather than saying, okay, here's how you're fearfully and wonderfully made, and we look at ourselves and say, I'm superior, you know. And I think, quite frankly, we've seen lots of examples in ministry of people who've collapsed because they've gone to the pride place.
Yeah.
I've got it, and if everybody else will get it like me, then they'll be okay, and their relationship is no longer in a place where, God, you're building into me. It's I've got it. I know the formula. I work the formula.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, it's the same trap we talked about falling into in the last episode, which
We go
was
to the other end, right?
interpretation.
Yeah.
I understand what God's doing, and I understand why He's doing it. And so, if God's telling me that this is how we should interact, if God's telling me to spend my time this way or get up at this time, it must mean I'm better.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And that's not because some of the times the reason why God is telling you to do those things is because He's addressing an area of brokenness in you that the person next to you doesn't have.
Right.
And sometimes it's because He's wired you differently. He's gifted you differently to do something that He's not asking them to do.
Right.
Yeah. You know, I think what can happen a lot, and again, I took us off a little bit on a side trail, but I'm there now, so I'm going to put my flag a little bit here. It even happens in churches. Right? Not so churches are the culmination of individuals who follow Jesus, right? So it's not surprising.
Right.
To where we see other churches who are doing blank in a particular way. And God is in responding blank in a particular way. You can fill that blank in. And the tendency is to think, okay, well, every church should be doing blank. And if they're not really following God.
Yeah.
And what the tendency is we become proof texters. Well, the proof is in the pudding. Look at blank is happening here, and it's not happening here, so we must have it right and you must have it wrong.
Yeah.
But you just made the point. And just like God's maybe working something in you, there's also, well, maybe God's working something in this body a particular way. Or, here's the thing,
So true.
you know, we are to be called to people becoming more and more like Jesus, but that journey for each of us looks unique.
Yeah.
You know, the old statement in churches, right? Healthy things grow. Well, it also depends on what type of plant you are. Right? There are pine trees that grow really, really fast but don't have great roots. There's oak trees, and then you just might be an azalea bush. You're gonna get really, really wide, right? And it's
right.
But you have to know and be comfortable with the fact that you're fearfully and wonderfully made and what God's designed. And that only comes through relationship. And the death knell of that, I think, both shame and in pride, is this type of thing that you're talking about, comparison of our experience, and think theirs should be like ours or ours should be like theirs. Will keep us from experiencing what God does.
It's that version of tribalism. I mean, I think about it in the local church, but I also think about it denominationally. I've got denominational roots. I know you do too.
Yeah.
And you know, I grew up in a very specific denomination, never saw anything else. And I remember when I entered young adulthood, you know, I thought, okay, well, the people who have it right are this specific denomination. And then I happened to go to a church that was not that specific denomination and went, wow, they love Jesus too. They may actually make it to heaven. You know? I mean, it was one of those funny experiences.
I mean, and again, I just took it sideways, but just had this moment that I think we could fall off on either side of that, right? And either way, the enemy has us stilted in our growing and our development.
Well, don't you think, like, almost the twin enemies for us are either shame or judgmentalism? Because that's where you land on both of those. Either I'm not good enough or I'm better than.
Yeah.
And then but we live in that trap of comparison, back to what you're pulling out. And comparison, instead of comparison being awe-inspiring and you know, expanding, it becomes our basis by which we justify, either my shame or my superiority, my judgmentalism.
Yeah, I mean, pride is either thinking more of yourself or less of yourself than God says you are. So just stop trying to interpret. Just keep asking God to show you what he's up to tell you what he's doing, to tell you what's true about him and about you. And I don't say that flippantly, like, well, that's the easiest thing in the world. And if you're not doing that, you're wrong. Welcome to shame. Right? But it's like that's the antidote to all of this is, what began with the Spirit continues with the Spirit. Stop trying to do it out of your own strength.
Yeah.
So I keep trying to get my categories to expand, right? So I don't fall into the trap of thinking that I know everything I need to know. Right. And so constantly reading. I'm actually in a program right now. It's running a full year that's throwing at me all kinds of things that I've never read before so that I can think about it in new ways. And so I came across this line from a book written by A.W. Tozer.
Which you're going to be a big fan of.
Yeah, that's come from my heritage. There you go. He's exactly right.
And so Tozer says in this book, which is titled Knowledge of the Holy.
Fantastic book.
Yeah. He says, knowledge of such a being, referring to God. Knowledge of God cannot be gained by study alone. That comes by a wisdom the natural man knows nothing of, neither can know, because it is spiritually discerned. To know God is at once the easiest and the most difficult thing in the world. It's easy because the knowledge is not won by hard mental toil, but it's something freely given. As sunlight falls free on the open field, so the knowledge of the holy God is a free gift to men who are open to receive it. But this knowledge is difficult because there are conditions to be met, and the obstinate nature of fallen man does not take kindly to them. And he goes on to outline these things that get in the way of us receiving this free gift from God, of God telling us who God is. He says that one of the things that gets in the way is all these other false comforts, these idols, and the sin which so easily entangles, that blind us, that distract us, that prevent us from receiving what God is trying to give us, which is himself. Right? And so this isn't about, clean yourself up so that you can approach God. Right? But it's the recognition of where am I trying to get something other than, or where am I trying to get the thing that God's giving me, but I'm trying to do it. No, God, you leave it on the shelf. I'm going to go get it. Right. I don't want you to give it to me.
Yeah. Right. When I need it, I'll access it.
Right. And he also says one of the things that gets in the way is it's basically the Sunday attendance phenomenon. He says that one of the things that gets in the way is that we don't utterly commit the whole life to God. We give him a part.
Which is a part of, our mission here is to help people be spirit directed.
Yeah.
And that little notion of being spirit directed is the key.
Yeah.
Is like, okay, I am inhabited by the Holy Spirit. We understand the mechanics of that, in terms of at the moment of conversion, the Holy Spirit is placed in us as a guarantee, a deposit. Ephesians tells us that. But allowing then the Holy Spirit to be active in my life and to whisper into those moments and to guide and direct my steps, to be spirit directed. I know very few people who are spirit directed that attend a program.
Yeah.
Spirit-directed people are day in, day out, moment by moment, leaning into their relationship, and they look far more like some of the descriptions that the Apostle Paul gives. That taking every thought captive, the discipline of my body, all of those kinds of things. But that's a spirit-directed activity.
Yeah. And the last thing that he says that gets in the way, he has a list of 6. This is just 3, but the last one that he mentions is that God is a person and can be known in increasing degrees of intimate acquaintance as we prepare our hearts for the wonder. And one of the things that made me think was that one of the things that gets in the way of us experiencing more of God is thinking that we already have. Right. That must be all there is. And so we stop. We stop looking. We stop expecting God to do anything differently than he's already done. And anybody who is doing anything differently, we're like, well, they'll catch up to where I am at some point, right? And it's just, we stop being curious. Mm-hmm. We stop expecting God to do something new. You can fall off on that the other way. You can always be looking for God to do the next new thing and never grow and mature in the things that he's been doing. But you can also stay stuck and feel like, well, that's probably all there is.
Do you think there's a natural tendency for that to happen when God comes in our life and we come to him, and we're going to use an analogy, because we know that like we've got, just had surgery on our knee and we need him to rehab it, right? And all of a sudden, boom, we can walk again. We're like, oh, I got full function.
Yep.
But we miss what it's like. Well, no, he maybe wants us to be a runner. Maybe he wants that sort of stuff. And we just get back to functioning, and then we think that's all that there is, right?
Still
and
walking
so,
with a limp.
yeah, exactly. We're not hurt, and I don't know if this analogy is fully fleshing out, but I feel like lots of times it's like, oh, God, you fixed that. I'm good now, right? And but no. It's like I want more for you.
Right.
I want that, and I think there are so many times in so many places of our life we've never even had healing. That once we get healing in that, the very thought that there's, I could be a runner,
right,
or I could be, no. But what does God say about that?
No, the illustration is perfect because and I've had multiple sports injuries, right? And so after the break heals and the torn ligament repair, right, then there's physical therapy. And there's a lot of people that don't do physical therapy because it hurts, right? And they just went through all this pain. And why would I willingly subject myself to more pain for what feels like a nominal, right?
Well,
I'm good enough where I am.
Yeah.
But then you sit through physical therapy and you rediscover, and let me say it again. I have always left physical therapy being able to do more than I could pre-injury.
Because I think our human tendency is comfort. And once I'm comfortable, I'm satisfied. That's it.
Yeah.
Rather than potential. And so I think about just periods in my life where, okay, God, I really need you here. I really need insight, direction, whatever. I need you here. And I'm leaning in and man, I'm getting so much. And then I get that direction. I go, okay, thanks.
Yeah.
And I'm not leaning in as much, and I'm missing the next chapter because I got comfortable. I got exactly where I needed to be to maintain comfort.
And what's really interesting is I think through that analogy is when we do that, it would not be uncommon that we find out having to go back and get another injury.
Exactly.
Right? Because we didn't allow God to do what he wanted to do fully in that moment.
Right.
We're like, okay, I'm good.
Right.
Again, I'm going to kind of lead into something we'll talk about in a couple of weeks. I referred to it in the last podcast, Joshua 6-8 is one of my favorite. That juxtaposition between Jericho and how Joshua followed God and Ai is alarming because they are literally days apart.
Right.
But Jericho, it was really, really clear God had to show up.
Right.
And Ai is like, I got it. Right? I got it.
Yeah.
God had to show up just as much as Ai at Jericho.
Yeah.
And you wind up, so interesting, the place that you wouldn't expect to get the injury, Ai, is the very place that you get it.
Right.
When you're like, oh, well, I should have got it here, but you didn't because of what you did here.
Right.
And there's just that tendency, I think, in my life, and I think for all of our lives, is that, and I'm going to back up. One of the reasons I think this tendency happens in my life is because I still don't fully grasp how much God loves me. And I'm like this. I'm not going to bother him with this. The very problem with that statement is I assume the God of the universe could ever be bothered.
Yeah.
Right? And so if you're like me, like, well, and you guys have all had this happen, right? People, Christian Fellowship Church, maybe someone listening right now, like, well, I don't want to bother you, Brian or Lee. I'm like, well, why do I do this? I'm like, you're not bothering me. This is what we love to do, right? You're not there's a problem, I think, when you get to, you're serving in a ministerial profession and someone gets too busy. That's crazy to me to work with people. But then I think the same thing about God. I won't say he's too busy, but I'm like, I'll just take care of this myself, right? Because I'm like, oh man, God, I'm coming back to you again. You think I should just be able to figure out how to do this on my own, so I got it. And we follow those moments.
So as we bring this in for a landing, thank you for sticking with us if you made it through this far. Goal is always to be practical, right? And so the goal is not for you to suddenly start doing it the way that Brian does or Lee does or I do.
I would encourage you not to do it the way that he does. He's still figuring it out. Right. You guys haven't figured it out, but I'm still figuring it out.
Well, and I feel like that's the best point is that's why it's so dangerous to follow a person.
Yeah.
Because we're all still figuring it out too. Yeah. And so, take what we've learned, which is oftentimes what not to do, right? Mm-hmm. Take hope in the things that God has done so redemptively in our own life. And then, the thing that we've said multiple times as we've wrapped up each of these rhythms is you have to do this, right? It's what Tozer said in the quote that we just referenced. Right? You can't acquire this just through understanding, just through reading a book. At some point, you do have to obey the call and begin to walk with God. And that's when you experience true transformation, right? It's not that you get fully transformed and then you and God go for a stroll. And it's not that God front loads all the transformation because he needs you to get your act together, right? So the transformation happens as we walk. And it's not easy, right? There are going to be pain points, sometimes because we're going to stumble and stub our toe, and sometimes because there's physical therapy that's needed for an old injury. But it's so much better than continuing to walk with a limp or never walking at all. And so daily devotion in particular, this rhythm, it's not easy, it's not comfortable. It'd be so much easier if we didn't do it. And you started your morning however you want. You spend your afternoon however you want. You go to bed, right? And just, God will see you someday later. And so stop for a moment. And instead of imagining all the challenges and all the difficulties and all the impediments, just invite God with your divine imagination to show you what this could look like 6 months from now. If you'd invested yourself in a mostly daily devotion that was maybe expanding in its categories and maybe stretching in ways that was a little uncomfortable at first, but think about what this rhythm could look like when this rhythm got comfortable. And maybe let that be a little bit of an encouragement, a little bit of a carrot that you dangle in front of you, a little bit of a goal that's up on the board.
Or donut. If donut.
Right.
Whatever.
Carrots are not motivational for
my
anybody
love
with the trail
language.
horse. But allow that feeling to come up, not the shame and not the comparison, but the goodness of what it would feel like for this to become more comfortable, more natural, more normal, and then invite God into the process, right? This is not where you create your 12-step plan of what I'm going to do to get closer to God. Ask today, God, what would be a good thing for us to do? Yeah. And it might be something new. It might be something that's category expanding, but it might be something you've been doing. Because this isn't about doing all the things. This is about walking with God.
Yeah. And I do, just reinforce it over and over and ask God. Maybe you listen to these last 2 podcasts and you're like, oh, I want to start doing that. I want to start doing that. Great. But maybe that's not where God wants you to start.
Yeah.
So you can be tendency, even in attempting to walk through this, repeating that same transactional. Yeah. We do it, right? We all do it. So again, I would even go so far as to say, don't try to do it like we do it. It's like, you can't.
Right.
You can't. I mean, old joke, we're all snowflakes, right? Uniquely one, that's what it really means. There's no other ones like the 3 of us, and that means you're not like that. And so trying to do that ultimately is going to fall short of what God wants for you.
Yeah. And the straight up answer to what God wants in this, and this is where we're all living in this, is he wants a relationship, not a business partnership. He's looking, you can't be married to my wife and I can't be married to your wife. It's our relationship. And it's unique and it's special and it's different and it's not formulaic. There are things that we do in rhythm, yes, but it's not formulaic. And God is inviting us into a relationship with him, which speaks back to that Tozer idea that it's our whole life, not a part of our life, and putting that in a place that says, God, what do you want? Because I when I think about imagining, I imagine what would it look like if my friendship with God goes beyond any other friendship I've ever had. Yeah. It's the best relationship in my life. That's what I bring.
Yeah. So friends, that's the invitation. Go be you with God and invite him to show you who you are and who he is. And we're just grateful that we get to be here for the journey.
Yeah.
So on behalf of Lee and Brian, I'm John. Questions, send them to faithforward@cfcwire.org. But again, thank you for being a part of our journey as we get to verbalize all of this. And thank you for the privilege of being part of yours. We'll see you next time.